Let's check on that dry mead we made, shall we? So we started this on March 25th. Today is April 13th. That is 19 days. And after 19 days, a lot has happened. But also, I'm seeing neutral pressure in that airlock, which means it might be done. That's not a guarantee. It's just a sign that it could be, or that fermentation is just really, really slowed down.
But let's take a closer investigation. So you can see there's still a bit of a bubbly foam at the top, and it's not a croissant type because it is not collecting the particles and the proteins. You can see there's a little residual protein mass right here. But these guys are making me think that fermentation might be done, might not be
I can
done.
see little teeny tiny
It
bubbles coming up when
could
you look.
also just be off-gassing, but because we are seeing little tiny bubbles come up, that's normally a sign of continued fermentation. But it certainly has slowed down.
And there's quite a bit of lees at the
Yep,
bottom.
we got the nice leaf cake at the bottom here. It's not too wispy, so I'm pretty happy with the flocculation there. And you can see our citrus peels there.
So overall, it's looking great. Okay, everything about this looks right. Now, because it started with only a 1.092 gravity, I know I say only. That's actually not that low. For us, it is. We usually make much higher ABV meads. So for us, this is a little bit on the lower side, which means it should be done faster. It'll clear out faster. It's already starting to clear slightly. You can see it's definitely not as cloudy as it once was. But let's take a reading, find out what it's doing.
Another benefit to using a lower gravity to start off with is it tends not to stress the yeast out as much.
Yeah.
Uh,
They have a much easier time.
Overfeeding the yeast is actually not really a good thing.
Yeah, a lot of people tend to, oh, I want to make more alcohol. So they will add a lot more sugars or fermentables than maybe they should right from the beginning. And that just makes it, wow, that just makes it really, really hard on your yeast. And, well, if your goal was to make more alcohol, you may not make more alcohol.
Let me get the glass.
You might actually get a stalled brew instead. Is that floating? Please tell me it's floating.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, I think it's floating. All right, I'll just have to pour some in. The reason why we want to know is it floating is because if it's not floating, I'm not getting an accurate reading. So as soon as this hydrometer is floating in the liquid, I can get an accurate reading. And this one looks to be, looks like 1.0, well, no, it's 1.000 on the nose. So this actually went dry. But is it finished completely? That's a question, and we don't have the answer yet.
And some of you may be confused, well, how can it go below 1.000? Well, that's because what this is actually measuring is the density of the liquid. So alcohol is
Like a 0.71
yeah.
specific gravity or 0.79 specific gravity. So it's actually below 1.000, which means enough alcohol mixed with water will actually be below 1.000. So it can go there easily. I'm just going to pour off a tiny little sample because this is very young. We don't expect this to taste great yet. It's only 19 days old. And I'm going to pour the rest in. Why? Because everything's been sanitized in.
The red bucket of sanitization!
If you did not sanitize your hydrometer and your tube and things like that,
Shame on you!
yeah, and don't pour it back in because if those things aren't clean and sanitized, you could be pouring microbes back in. Let's put the airlock back on this. And again, our airlock is filled with either sanitizer liquid, which is basically just the stuff that's in turbos, or a cheap alcohol of your choice. I prefer Scoresby Scotch for that because I hate it. And I do. I'm going to put that back on there. And now we're all back to normal. Everything's good, right? It's sealed up. But we do want to get a little taste on this. You know, for 19 days and being dry. See, a sweeter mead, a sweeter brew covers up a lot of things. A lot of the newer sulfur smells, things like that are caused during fermentation, things that are rather unpleasant in a dry brew. Sweet brews can cover those things up. Whereas a dry brew, everything's out in the open. You kind of know. In the smell, in the taste, everything. She's smiling. That's interesting. I do get a little bit of citrus on the smell. The honey, the fermented honey is there. Wow.
for a dry mead.
Oh my God. That's actually not bad at all.
Yeah.
Um, we're starting to make more dry stuff. A lot of people have asked, and there's various reasons why. If you don't know, watch our other channel. It's all about that. But we are trying to do that for a variety of reasons. Now, this one, I'm going to calculate the alcohol because I believe this is finished. We are going to wait a week and take another reading, but I believe this is finished. I just want to see what the alcohol content is right now. So to calculate our ABV, we start with our original gravity, which is 1.092, minus today's gravity, which is 1.000, and we get 0.092. Times 135, which is my coefficient of choice. Some people use 131.25. I find 135 to be more accurate when you're doing anything but like a beer. I mean, anything 7% and higher, this is going to be more accurate. And I get 12.42% alcohol.
Not too shabby.
Not bad at all. That's actually pretty respectable and in the same range as what we used to make with the sweet brews all the time. And this did it in less than 19 days. This was ready probably 4 or 5 days ago. We just haven't had a chance to check on it, which is another point. There's no rush, okay? We're not racking this yet. We're not doing anything to it. We just took our first reading, and in a week, we're going to take another one. See you then. So, a week's gone by. Time to check it again. So a week ago when we checked this, it was at 1.000. Today it's at like 0.999. I mean, it seems to have gone down just ever so slightly, but it's done for all intents and purposes. So we are going to rack this. So for that, I'm going to need a wide mouth fermenter. Now you may be wondering why I said I need a wide mouth fermenter. It's not really because I need a wide mouth, it's because they're slightly different sizes. This is a 1.2 gallon actually, even though it says gallon. That's about 1 full gallon in the wide mouth. So when I rack this off and I get rid of all the lees, I'm gonna have a little bit less, so I don't want too much headspace, so I know putting it in there will be just fine. And I also want to pour this directly into here, because if I pour it into the primary fermenter, well, I'm very likely to stir up all that lees and make it where racking it off of it doesn't really serve any purpose now, does it?
Almost sounds like he's talking from experience, doesn't it?
Yeah, I've done that a few times. By the way, before we get too much further, everything has been sanitized in
the red bucket of sanitization!
And that's why I didn't have any problem pouring that liquid right back in and, keeping it in the fermentation process because it was clean. Everything was clean. So we're going to put this down here. This is our destination vessel, and we have our source right here. I'm going to take our auto siphon, and yes, you really do want to siphon this rather than pour or filter or any of those other ways of doing this. It's just cheap, efficient, practical, makes sense, and it works. That's why people have been doing it for hundreds of years.
The reason why we do it this way is because we're trying to limit the exposure to oxygen once our brew has been fermented. There's alcohol there. We don't want vinegar.
Right. Acetobacters, which is what makes vinegar, can activate in the presence of oxygen and alcohol. So, because this was a sealed container that was producing CO2, and CO2 is heavier than oxygen, up until I took that airlock off, there was no oxygen in here. It was all CO2. Now, there's probably still quite a bit of CO2 blanket, but as I'm moving things around and disturbing it, there is some oxygen going in. Some might argue that even my very talking nearby could be doing it. Sure, to some extent. However, the amount of air that's actually going to be able to get in there is so minimal. So we are racking it right now into the next vessel. We're going to put a lid on it as soon as possible, and hopefully that eliminates the amount of oxygen that could be touching it.
Besides making vinegar, we can also introduce off flavors, and we're trying to avoid that as well.
So, as predicted, because we went from a larger vessel to a smaller vessel, we are just past the shoulder, minimizing that headspace, so we should be just fine. Getting an airlock on there, so that way any degassing that happens is just going to keep that idea going. Some people will say you should degas at this point. I'm not in this case because I want to keep some of that CO2 coming out to preserve that blanket there and keep oxygen out while this conditions. You might say, how long is it going to condition for? It's hard to say, but probably a few weeks. It should clear up a little bit more. Getting it off of all this stuff, getting everything out of there should help a bit. And right now it is starting to clear already, so it's probably at that point. By the way, if you were curious about loss, that's about all we lost on this one. Not very much at all. That's like, I don't know, just a couple of fluid ounces. It's not even very much at all because we did end up with a full gallon. That's a full gallon in that jar. So this is just going to go, and what's it going to do?
It's going to sit
For a couple weeks. Let it clear out, and then we'll be back to rack it again and bottle it off. All right, so it's been 9 days, so that means we are on day 27 now of this mead. And, well, we already did 2 checks on it, and they both came out basically the same. So we haven't diluted it, we haven't added anything to it. Therefore, it's done. And now it's actually clearing out a little bit. It'll clear a little bit more in the bottle, but let's put this in the bottle, and then, in a couple days, you'll see us do a tasting.
But first, we're going to take a preliminary tasting to make sure we don't need to adjust it in any way.
Exactly. It's always good to do that just before you put it in the bottle. That way, what you put in the bottle is what you should expect. And, if you needed any sweetening or things like that, it's always a good idea. In our case, we're trying to make a dry mead, so we don't really want to add too much sweetener if it's at all avoidable, you might say. Oh, I'll try to not clank the bottle too much, too. That's a big sample. Oh, well. It's like 9 a.m. Why not, right? Okay. Usually, drier meads have more of a foot smell. And what I mean by that is if yeasts are a little bit stressed or if the mead doesn't have any sweetness to it, they tend to not taste so good. Like they have a little bit of a sulfury smell or things like that. This doesn't at all. It actually smells very clean.
It has a hint of it at the end, but forward, it's really honey in the aroma.
Keep in mind, this is 4 weeks old and bone dry. This was 0.999 for specific gravity. So this is as dry as you're going to get. But I remember when we took a sample taste once before, this was good. Wow. I taste honey. The honey character is so strong.
Yeah, it's interesting to get the honey notes without the sweetness.
Yeah. And this is this is like 13.6% alcohol. That's kind of awesome. A 12% mead, that dry, this young, tastes actually really wonderful. I would drink it as it is. Let's bottle.
So normally we would rack from this to a pitcher and then from the pitcher to the bottles. But upon closer inspection, we noticed there is practically no lees in here whatsoever. So we're going to skip that part and go directly from this to our bottles.
And today we're going to be using some 1-liter bottles that we have, swing tops. Obviously, we love swing tops. They are my favorite type of bottle to use for all of our bottling needs. However, there are some screw tops that are quite nice as well. We don't use corks, mostly because they're disposable. We want to reuse the bottles, and these things are great. You can reuse this seal over and over again for years, and then you can get cheap replacements very inexpensively.
We do have one 750 milliliter bottle amongst our 1 liters, just because that's what we had.
Because a gallon is actually 3.785 liters. So we have 1, 2, 3, and 0.750. So with the rather large tasting sample that we had, we probably have exactly 4 bottles. Watch me eat my words later on when one of them is only half full, but we're going to go with that story for now.
So, of course, we've cleaned and sanitized our bottles.
What did we sanitize everything in?
The red bucket of sanitization!
The delayed reaction. Gotta love it. And we're going to use an auto siphon for this, just like we always do, with a bottling wand. Bottling wand has the springy thingy on the end, also known as
a stem valve.
Yeah. And all we do is just put that on the end of the tubing, just a little bit. It is the same auto siphon. Some people seem to think that you need 2 auto siphons so that one of them can have the bottling wand attached. No, that's just crazy.
You can if you want to.
There's no need.
But we don't.
Now, to do this with an auto siphon and a bottling wand, you need usually 4 hands. If you don't have 4 hands, you can just push this down with 1 hand and try to siphon with the other. It's a little bit complicated, but it can actually be done. And I just want to get it started, get all the air out of the system, and then that can drop to the bottom, and then I'll take over here. It works great with 2 people because she can feed bottles and take the full ones while I keep filling them. It makes for less mess. When I used to do this all by myself, I'd hold a bottle like between my legs and start the siphon with 1 hand and things like that.
He would normally end up with a bit of the brew in his lap.
Yeah, I wore some of it. Not a lot, but some. We do get a lot of people asking, can I just pour it? Or can I use filters like coffee filters and things like that? There are specific wine filters. I'm not even going to get into those. To me, I don't think it's necessary to filter it. As far as pouring it or using coffee filters, a siphon is the easiest way. If you don't have an auto siphon, hold on. I had to switch bottles here because that one's full. If you don't have an auto siphon, you can just use the tubing, which is really, really cheap. But an auto siphon is less than 20 bucks in most areas. And Amazon has them. We have the link right in the description of this video on how to get one. They're really inexpensive. You'll have it for years. If you cannot possibly get it, just use plastic or silicone tubing. Anything food grade is good enough. And, just fill it with liquid, like dunk it in there, both ends. Make sure your hands are sanitized. And put one end in the bottle, the other one in there, and when you open that up, it'll siphon. It's just a siphon.
Basically, like most things, you can make this as complicated or as easy as you choose to do.
And as messy as you want.
We try to keep it as simple and cost-effective as possible, yet still prioritizing safety.
If you do decide to do the tube method, the one part of that I would recommend not doing is putting your mouth on one end to start the siphon, because you went through all this effort to keep it infection free all this time. Adding bacteria from your mouth directly to the brew at the end for bottling, probably not the smartest thing to do. So I would probably avoid doing that. Pouring it, this is 12%. It has a chance of becoming vinegar because 15% is the actual cutoff for vinegar, but it's not as likely. I mean, if you really have no option and you can pour really, really carefully without splashing, it's almost acceptable to do it, but it's still not good. It's not a good idea because you can still oxidize and get off flavors. It's just not the best way to go. Don't even get me started on coffee filters. Bad idea.
We have a video on that.
We actually have a video on that, yeah, and it's still, don't do it. You will oxidize the heck out of your brew, and it takes forever. Remember what I said before about eating my words about a half bottle? I'm fairly certain, though, that when people measure bottles, 1 liter's like here.
Yeah.
It's got to be. Because, like, this is a 1-gallon jar, but you would think the gallon would be all the way up here, but it's actually not. It's, like, down here. And with our smaller ones, the ones that the free apple juice comes in, they're actually 1.2 gallons all the way up in the neck. So, marketing. Just call it a 0.9 liter bottle. I don't care, but it's just, that's annoying. Or a 1.1 liter bottle, because it'd be the other way, yeah. So anyway, this is now going to be our taster, which means this one will just sit on the shelf for a couple of days. The amount of headroom is not a great way for storage, okay? That's why we're going to drink this one sooner rather than later. These other 3 are perfectly fine. See how high up it is there.
So what that means is that these can be stored in a relatively level temperature, dark environment.
Room temperature.
And
or chilled.
They'll be fine. This guy is going in the fridge.
Mm-hmm. Well, once we drink some of it
yes.
in the tasting, because we do our tastings at room temperature now.
Yes.
But one of these will actually get put away for a whole year, okay? And we'll do our 1-year tasting on it. The others, I will probably drink them sooner because this is good and it's dry, which means not a lot of carbs, which means I can drink it. Anyway, so we'll see you in a couple days with a tasting on this one. And if you like this video, look up. There's another one up there. You might like that one too.